The angel says, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and, surprisingly, there are 7 kings." And then he says, and this is what's crucial for us, 5 have fallen, 1 is, present tense, and the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. Now, on all hands, we understand that the book of Revelation was written at some time under imperial Rome's oversight, during the time of the Roman Empire. And so we are to see, when this angel interprets for John these 7 heads, that he says that the 7 heads represent 7 mountains. And when you realize that this was written during the time of imperial Rome, that which would naturally spring to mind in the original audience was the 7 hills of Rome, a very famous feature. Even in antiquity, Rome was known as the city on 7 hills. And so here we have a clear geographical referent to somehow this beast being associated with Rome, which was the city on the 7 hills. But who are the 7 kings? I believe that what he's telling us here is that these are the emperors. This is the line of emperors from Julius Caesar that he's counting forward. The first emperor being Julius Caesar, and he says 5 have fallen. The first is Julius, the second is Augustus Caesar, and then the third is Tiberius, and then Gaius Caesar, and then Claudius Caesar. The angel tells us that the first 5 have fallen. Then he says 1 is. And as a matter of fact, Nero Caesar was the 6th in the line of the emperors of Rome. And this tells us that Nero is alive. This tells us, therefore, that it's prior to June 8th, AD 68, because at that time Nero commits suicide as the Roman Empire erupts into flames through civil war. And then he says, and remarkably, the other, that is the 7th, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he shall remain a short while. Well, since Rome has been cast into the throes of civil war, and Nero dies after a reign of 13.5 years, interestingly, the next emperor is Galba. The 7th is Galba, and he reigns from the death of Nero in June until that next January. He reigns but 6 months. After the 13.5-year leadership of Nero, we have a 6-month span for this emperor. And so I think the evidence here is quite suggestive. The temple is standing, Nero is alive. Those being true, then we are to understand that the book of Revelation obviously was written prior to the destruction of the temple. Well, as I said, that's only a little tip of the iceberg there. You'll have to check other sources to get more material on that. But I'm sure what you're especially interested in is what the book of Revelation teaches us. And so now I'd like to consider this expectation of Revelation, the expectation of Revelation. We need to discern, what does John expect in the writing of this Revelation? And here it's vitally important to understand the original audience and what they, or how they would read this book. 3 factors will emphasize the historical circumstances of John's original recipients of this glorious revelation. And the first of these factors that points to his expectation is audience relevance. John writes to 7 historical churches. In Revelation 1:4, he says, John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia. In verse 11, he names those churches. And then in chapters 2 and 3, he gives evidence of knowing those churches quite well, because they're subtle indicators of their culture, their social setting, and of their circumstances in the first century when John writes. And so John writes to 7 historical churches. And then also we notice that he wrote in order to be understood. Look at verse 3 of chapter 1. Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of the prophecy and keep those things written in it. The idea of hearing is not just receiving audible intonations, but that it is actually hearing with discernment so that they can keep what He has commanded them, so that they would keep those things written in it. Therefore, it is directly relevant to the first century church, particularly those seven. To the first century church, it is not directly relevant to a church 2,000 years later. He is writing to a particular historical audience. And then notice that this particular historical audience is already in tribulation. In verse 9 of chapter 1, John says, I, John, your brother and companion in the tribulation. In chapters 2 and 3, when he addresses the seven churches, he highlights some growing problems that they are facing. Some among them are being killed. There's an awful onslaught of Satan in some of those churches. He's dealing, in other words, with real Christians with their sandals firmly planted in the first century. And so he is talking to them who have real problems, and he's not taunting them about Cobra helicopters and things like that 2,000 years away. He's telling them about events that are going to be dealing with their circumstances. They are in tribulation. They need to know what is to become of them and what is to become of the faith that they have committed themselves to that is causing this tribulation. And so audience relevance is so important to keep in mind as you read the book of Revelation. Then also the contemporary expectation. Interpretation of the book of Revelation must begin in the first chapter. John very clearly expects the events that he prophesies to begin occurring soon. Notice, I'm going to give you two evidences of this. One is varied expression. He uses two different terms. And a second will be strategic placement of those terms. Let's consider first varied expressions that John uses. In verse 1, John says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave Him to show His servants things which must shortly take place. These things must shortly take place. That is the Greek word tachos, like our word tachometer. Tachos. It means shortly. It doesn't mean thousands of years later. It means shortly to take place. This word occurs also in chapter 2:16, 3:11, 22:6, and in its adverbial form in 22:7, 12, and 20. And so he uses the term tachos, which means shortly, and then he also uses another term. In case you missed that one, in case you skip over the first verse, or you don't realize the implications of it, in verse 3 he uses another term. He says, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and keep the things written, for the time is near. Here the Greek word is ingus, and it literally means at arm's length. I mean, it has to do with the limb. Guion means the limb, and it's at arm's length. It's something that is at hand in a very literalistic fashion if you were to interpret the word as at hand instead of near. This word also occurs in chapter 22, verse 10, which I read for you a few moments ago. Clearly, the temporal impression that the original audience under tribulational affliction would perceive from this book is that John really expected these things to shortly come to pass because the time is at hand. And not only does he use two different terms to express this, but he places them strategically in the book, in the very opening of the book and the very closing, when you enter into the world of Revelation and when you exit out of it. In the introduction, he tells them what will be very soon, and then he reminds them of that as he closes the book down. These are in the didactic portions of the book of Revelation, where he addresses them and says to the seven churches and tells them things about the love of Christ and the blood of Christ. This is in the didactic portion. Before you get to the dramatic images, the seven-headed beast, the locust with men's faces, the fire-breathing prophets, and a lamb that's dead but really alive. Before you get to all of those images, you have once again a didactic introduction. Very plain and very clear in my understanding of this.